As we saw in the past episode, the first form of social and political organization in ancient Greece and ancient Italy was not the complex and broad reality of a large city-state, much less of a multi-ethnic empire. The people who settled in these regions came from a common Indo-European cultural and linguistic base, shared to some extent with India, and in their development as nomadic peoples had probably already organized themselves in clans and families. The religion of the family, inherited since prehistoric times, gave way to the common myths upon which the Greco-Italian family was constituted. This religion ruled all of its institutions and social forms, to the point of literally considering these families as religious organizations themselves. Numa Denis Fustel de Coulanges defines in his essay The Ancient City, upon which this video is largely based, in a very precise way, the family as a group of people to which religion allowed to invoke the same Vesta and make funerary food offerings to the same ancestors. So, in a very different way from what the modern conception of a family is, the ancient family was held together not necessarily by love, but by the sense of belonging to the same religious cult. We must get rid of our generally biologically linked view of a family unit, which is in most cases a very small group united by genetical proximity and affection. This is not the case when we speak of ancient Greek and Italian families. Understanding the family as both a micro-society and a political entity is something we rarely associate with our modern notion of families, which we see as nuclear and small, without any complex type of politics beyond how mom and/or dad want to exercise authority over their offspring, and with ever more limitations from the state to do so. These religious archaic families were instituted almost like a church, with the father as supreme head or pontiff and everyone else in it subject to his authority. And when I say everyone else, I mean literally hundreds, perhaps thousands of people, because ancient families could count many members among their ranks. These tribal units were the first form of organized society in Western antiquity and did not know the constraints or limitations coming from a state power over them. They were the state themselves. This church-like group functioned as a complete and closed society with a hierarchy in the form of a pyramid, a few privileged in the top and the large majority down the ladder. First came the senior branch, composed by the ruling father, in Latin pater familias, in Greek despotis, and his eldest son, who wholly inherited and succeeded the father in his role. All property and members of the family were his to use, with power limits only to be found within the rules of the religion itself. The father ruled as king, pontiff, and judge in this microcosmos. After the senior branch came the cadet branches, made up of the younger siblings and their descendants who didn't inherit and were subjected all of their lives, as if they were minors, to the paterfamilias, even if they all descended from the same ancestor. Finally, clients came third. These were subjected as serfs to the family, tied to their estate and were part of its inheritance. They didn't share the common ancestors, but they were allowed to invoke them and lived under the protection of the paterfamilias, under whose grip they served. Such was the ancient family, known in Latin as gens, a whole society, albeit small in its own right, existing with a hierarchical segmentation and dominated by religion. This, of course, can be known through a reconstruction of how these ancient tribal entities used to be, by using what renowned authors from classical antiquity themselves said about the development of their institutions, whenever they spoke about the past form of the societies they lived in. Many of those, like Plato, Aristotle, Herodotus, Seneca, Cato the Younger, Cicero, Titus Livius, amongst others, lived in a much later period to the one in which clans were the only known form of society. Another thing to note is that the formation, climax, and decline of these families in their primitive form occurred in different places at different times, so we can't really give an exact period of time for each phase this institution went through. But we do know that written sources all across Italy and Greece and even India give us a clear idea of how they worked, which ideas constituted them, and how did they decline to finally become a shadow of their former self when humanity moved from tribal units to bigger and more complex groups like cities. Another thing to note is that this religious family understood its members to be both the deceased ancestors, constantly demanding sacrifices and food, and the living engaging in this contract. The fact that the family was mostly constituted, although not exclusively created, by the domestic religion had several implications in its legal, social, economic, and ethical reality. Far from the rule of law we will see in the future republics of city-states, this was a society of norms, castes, and privileges, which had its institutions fully committed to the religious tradition above everything else. These are the foundational pieces of many subsequent laws and institutions to come. It's commonly believed that the oldest institution within ancient tribal religious family was the formal union of a man and a woman in a sacred bond, whose purpose was to continue the religious cult of the family by producing male descendants. Marriage is as ancient in the Indo-European tradition as the religion itself is. Both in Greek and Roman marriages, a woman that married a man had to undergo an initiation rite, marked by two steps. First, her father formally removed her daughter's links to his domestic cult. Secondly, her husband must, in the wedding ritual, literally introduce her in a forceful way to the new house. And finally, they had to share a meal, in the Roman case, usually a flour cake known as panis farreus, together near the sacred fire of Vesta and in the presence of their ancestors, to fully integrate the woman in the new cult. So, more than being an act of love, although this could be the case, marriage was a very special kind of adoption in which the husband formally adopted his wife, making her renounce her own gods and introducing her into his cult. Marriage had a very specific purpose: the continuation of the family's cult through the male line. In this archaic form of marriage, the wife lived as a legal minor under the authority of her husband, to which she now owed obedience. The need of producing male heirs to perpetuate the family's cult by establishing a continuous line of paterfamilias gave every man the duty to marry. It was intended that every man should marry and perpetuate their cult. A man having more than one wife would mean reducing the chances for other men to also marry and continue their religious heritage. This explains why in Indo-European cultures, polygamy was an undesirable practice and divorce became extremely difficult. The domestic religion considered marriage as a lifelong, holy and monogamous union, which produced the heirs of the cult. This marital institution shaped the culture of the family in many ways. Consequently, adultery was deemed immoral and as a high offense. The wife had to obey her husband, but it is also true that ancient morality prescribed that both husband and wife had to respect each other. The wife had a special dignity in the family cult, often sharing the same title as her husband. In Greek, Ikodespotis for the husband, Ikodespina for the wife. In Latin, paterfamilias for the husband and materfamilias for the wife. And considering her of high importance in the celebration of sacrifice and maintenance of the sacred fire, which was personified as the feminine, often motherly form of Vesta. Thus, it was expected from the wife and from the husband too, to be chaste, to display religious piety, dignity, but also love and tenderness for her children. As Dionysius of Halicarnassus puts it, while obeying her husband in everything, she was the lady of the house and her husband was the lord. The son ought to obey and love his parents, and the parents shall also love him. The house was to be respected and loved too, as the physical realm of the ancestors. So important was the production of a male heir to the ancients that some laws, according to Plutarch in his biography of Lycurgus of Sparta, when referring to Spartan law, say that an elderly man with a young wife, if he looked with favor and esteem on some fair and noble young man, might introduce him to her and adopt her offspring by such a noble father as his own. Meaning that, if the husband was incapable of producing children with his wife, then another man could take on the job for him. But why was the perpetuation of the family so important for these people? In most societies of the 21st century, not having children isn't a big deal, at least as a microeconomic decision for small family units. But in ancient Greece and Italy, for most of their history, having no male heir meant there would be no chief priest to continue the family cult. Since the family was constituted upon a contract between the dead and the living, this implied the ancestors would be forgotten and damned, as there would be no sacrifice, and the living would be dispersed, as there would be no leader. In other words, a whole society and a whole religion would perish. Aside from marriage, adoption was legally and socially accepted as a figure to continue with the domestic cult, and it was practiced in Greece, India, and Italy. Adoption was a way in which a family could acquire a new member not through procreation, but by initiating he or she in the domestic cult. This implied that the new member had to be emancipated and renounce to a previous cult to enter a new family. The Romans called this sacrorum detestatio. The Indians and the Greeks considered adoption to be a last resort for a man, who had no other option to continue his family cult but to adopt. Romans, instead, were more liberal on the matter, by allowing a man to have natural and adoptive sons. There were still ardent debates on the issue. Cicero, in his Pro Domo Sua speech, says, "Which is the right that regulates adoption? Is it not necessary for the adopting man to be past the age of not having children, and that before adopting has tried to have them? To adopt is to ask from the law and religion that which has not been obtained from nature." As a consequence of the religious constitution of the family, kinship bonds and relationships were determined by participation in the same cult, and not necessarily by biological or emotional closeness. Also, since the cult was only carried by men, only male links could determine kinship. In the Roman case, we have two types of family relations, agnation and cognation. What we know as agnation, agnatio, came to be a family bond by belonging to a common cult, which allowed all agnates to honor a common ancestor. Originally, this was considered the only form of family connection, excluding all those who descended from female lines. Whereas cognation, cognatio, is a more recent innovation by considering legal relation by blood, not taking religion into account. Cognation admitted women as part of one's family, and even until the times of Emperor Justinian in the 6th century, there would be a dispute on which of the two forms of relationship should prevail before the law. In more archaic times, only agnation was considered to establish family relations between people. Later, when the domestic religion loosened its grip on society, cognation would also appear too, and eventually gain more importance. In fact, the legal dispute between succession by agnation or cognation can be seen in many dynastic disputes in Western history, such as the beginning of the 100 Years' War, in which England supported the succession of the last Capetian king of France by cognation, which would accordingly give the right of succession to the English King Edward III, who declared himself the rightful heir to the French throne. Whereas the French court, unwilling to enthrone an English king, invoked the Salic law, which considered agnation as the prevalent form of kinship, thus excluding the descendants from the female line, and named Philip of Valois as King Philip VI of France. The succession laws in most European monarchies preferred the male line. Some, like the Habsburgs, after the death of Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, or the Hanovers, after the death of Queen Victoria, changed the dynasty's name when the direct male line died out, although it continued through the female line by taking the queen's husband family name. As for the right and concept of private property, according to the constitutional framework of the domestic religion, it was part of the indissoluble heritage of what constitutes the family cult. Since the transformation to a sedentary way of life, the ancients adapted the elements of their old nomadic traditions to a physically stable form, a fixed wooden or stone house to live in, hosting a burning vesta, and larger and more beautiful tombs for the dead. With this, you have the need of a house to live in and hold the sacred fire, and fields to live off the land and bury the dead. But more importantly, you need to separate the tombs of your ancestors from others, as the bones of the dead of different clans should never mix, because they were the unique heritage of each tribe. What you basically need is the concept of private property, something that comes as an innovation of sedentarism, but it does inherit that nomadic concept of the collective being the owner and not the individual. This means that religion demanded the need for each clan to own physical property. It legitimized it. But property also nurtured religious beliefs in turn, namely by creating new deities, the god Terminus, who separates the properties of each family. Terminus, as a concept, is literally the god of property. A terminus would be represented as a stone monument that's separating the dwelling of one family from another, by not allowing their ancestors and their living descendants to mix. This is a far cry from our modern notion of individual property, because, as mentioned before, even if the paterfamilias or any other family member had the individual rights to use the property, individuals owned nothing, because the clan itself was considered to be the actual owner of the land, buildings, and objects therein. The families who owned property were understood as this religious and temporal association which joined the dead, manes and lares, the living and those yet to be born. As such, property expropriation by the nascent central powers of city-states was a rare thing to be seen in the early development of these polities, because the right of property was centered on religion and not as a product of work. We shall see in how this will change when a series of later revolutions destroyed the religious constitution of families and cities. Plato speaks of this old institution in Book 13 of his Laws, by defending the holiness of property as belonging to the religious collective and not for any individual to dispose freely. The first law, that of Zeus, the boundary god, shall be stated thus: no man shall move boundary marks of land, whether they be those of a neighbor who is a native citizen or those of a foreigner. The fact that dead people could legally own property will be seen again in medieval and modern law through figures such as mormant in France, French for dead hands, which recognized the property of assets by dead people. This figure came to be widespread in several Latin American countries with vast land holdings in the hands of dead people, but in practice administered by the Catholic Church as a kind of trust. This is known in Spanish as bienes de manos muertas and existed in some regions until the 20th century. Males are the necessary heirs because of the prevalence religion places on the divine masculine as the way to perpetuate the cult. Women, naturally, couldn't inherit, although this would later change, as we will see. An adopted man inherits his adoptive family's property. If he wanted to inherit in his natural family, he must have abandoned his current adoptive cult and embraced the new one, for no man or woman can have more than one ancestral religion. In the earliest periods of Greek and Italian history, there was no right to leave property through a will, for it was the domain of a transcendental entity. The right to leave a will would come with later concepts of individualism, in which individual possession of property was accepted. When a father died, the firstborn inherited the whole of the property, and his brothers and sisters lived under his authority and do not possess but enjoy collectively. Fatherly authority was inherited in an absolute and indivisible manner, together with property. The indivisibility of paternal authority and property were crucial ingredients in the strength of these clans, as we will later see. Of course, these rules refer to a primitive era in Greek, Roman, and Indian institutional history. Some of it is written, like in Manus Miriti or the Laws of Manu in India, and some of it, mostly Italian, is inferred from later texts. Laws would eventually change as the domestic religion lost its role as the central constituting belief in society. Marriage, adoption, property, authority, inheritance, hierarchy. We can see how the norms that governed these societies of clans started to play a key role in how humanity started to build associations in the Western world on the basis of religion. This can give us a clear insight to Antiquities' first social building block. Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We would receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share it if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe.